Hey, Tyler, welcome to the podcast.
Derek, thank you for having me. Very exciting to be here.
Yeah, I'm curious to see where this goes. I feel like it's maybe your appearance here on the show is even more unpredictable than some other guests who I've heavily researched, partly because we're going to be interviewing you and interviewing, you're going to be doing some channeling. So let's just start with, how did you get into this? How did you come to be channeling other entities?
Yeah, okay. So back in the 2012 time period, where a lot of people were starting to have awakenings of different degrees, I also started having my own awakening. And what that means to me is recognizing that what the mainstream culture is offering is ultimately hollow and is not a place where true fulfillment can be found. So I began to research and explore into alternate culture. That began with meditation, that began with breathing exercises, that began with just synchronicity bringing me people who were kind of already on that path, who for a certain period of time mentored me a little bit. And it led me into the world of channeling just through looking for a way to contextualize from a higher perspective what these awakenings meant and where they were bringing me. So the first channel I really got into was the channel Daryl Anka, who brings forth the extraterrestrial entity known as Bashar. And I really dove into that material. Very advanced metaphysical concepts, ideas that I had never heard anyone put into words, but really deeply resonated with me. And for a while, a lot of my listening to that was just out of fascination.
Yeah.
Like, I was so mind blown with what was coming through. And then I said, well, what happens if I apply, like, in a really dedicated way, the teaching that this being is bringing forth, which is a teaching pretty much on what Joseph Campbell would describe as the hero's journey and the premise of following your bliss, right? So that is essentially all this entity, Bashar, communicates. It's the crux of his message is follow your highest excitement. And I really began doing that. And within no more than a week, everything in my life changed. Everything very, very quickly. I started having psychedelic experiences just through being in nature and exposing myself in a more shamanic or meditative way to the elements. And things got very psychedelic. I had a full-blown clairvoyant activation where I was in my room and I started having just visions. I started seeing like Native American people. I started seeing very complex geometries. I started traveling astrally through that state. And then when I returned to a more conscious state of being and I opened my eyes, it was like I was in the spirit world, but while in my bedroom. I open my eyes and I am looking at my body. I can see what in yoga they call the nadis, right? These energy channels, golden energy channels all over my system. I was seeing orbs of light flowing all around my body. And I'm looking around my room and I'm seeing these strange, almost animal-like, like I would describe them as Chinese mythical animal-like beings. And I was like, whoa, what is happening? And I sustained that for as long as I could, but eventually I left the bedroom, which was sort of the container for that space. And then very quickly, the visionary quality decreased. But it really got me thinking about, okay, what's actually happening and what is actually real if I just had that experience through meditating in nature and then going into my room. And right around this time, I started seeing strange things in the sky that at first I thought were constellations. They were triangular in nature, essentially equilateral triangle shape, but very big. So you would think, oh, that's a constellation because there's just these three stars that seem, very far apart. And I would see them while driving. And then I noticed one day while driving, no matter where I went, I could see this triangular formation in the sky. And I was like, that's weird. Like, it's not stationary. It seems to be moving. And it happened a few times. And one time I just stopped my car and I looked up and I watched it continue. And that's when I was like, oh, that's not a constellation. That, I don't know what that is. Is that a spaceship? And that got me questioning. And that happened 3 times in the hometown that I grew up in. And that was Delaware. That's where I'm from originally. And then when I moved to Connecticut, which I moved to mainly for acupuncture training, I had a much close encounter with a bunch of people. It was at least 4 of us all together. And we were driving on the highway, and there's forest on both sides of the highway. And I'm looking up, and all of a sudden I see not a constellation version of the triangle, but an actual triangular craft, like 3D solid craft hovering above the forest. And none of us spoke when we saw this. We all saw it and immediately was like registered as that's not something we have a context for. We have no reference for that. What the heck is that? And in my head, I'm like, this is the same stuff the channel Daryl Anka saw. I'm like, I'm getting this too. What the heck? I was like, this is crazy. I'm like watching that world that seemed almost fantastical come to life in a solid way. And that got me really curious into channeling. So I just began practicing. I attended a few different classes. Most of them were videos that had been released online, just YouTube stuff. Some of them were very advanced, but have since been taken down. I think, not because of like censorship, but I think because the person who released the class was like, oh, this is supposed to be private. So they took it down. But I practiced those techniques and began working with beings that we would understand as Pleiadians. They're of the Pleiadian system. And this is a group that is a part of many Native American cultures. Many Native American people claim to have a relationship with the Pleiadians. And the first entity I brought through that practice was a being that went by the name Mira, M-I-R-A. And I was really surprised at the usefulness of the information. And that night I got on Google, right? Because, we're in the research age. So I'm like, okay, Pleiadians Mira. And someone else had brought them through as well. I wasn't the only person who tuned into them. And that's when I was like, okay, I'm doing something that is legitimate here. I don't know how it's happening, but I'm doing it. So I just kept practicing, refining, and eventually I made contact with the civilization that Bashar is of and that the entity Elan is of, which is the Essasani civilization. And both of those channels, Bashar and Elan, were very instrumental to my awakening. And I feel that they really set the stage for more information and more energy to come through in that way. So I have been working with that collective, the Essasani collective, ever since then. And I channel an entity or a being from that collective who uses the name Ryok as a means of identifying him in a unique way amongst the members of the collective. And it's been a powerful journey. I have seen old parts of myself, the dead weight just get burned away. And sometimes, that's like a really holy fire where you're like, wow, like this is divine transformation. And other times, it feels like the fires of hell. You're like, whoa, I feel like this is so much power. It's so much transformation. What do I do? So that road was not always easy. I didn't have a mentor going through it. So a lot of it was trial and error integrating that. But at a certain point through the practices that I do, I focus heavily on Hermetic practices, Taoist practices, and working with the mentors that I did through those practices, I was able to really get a stronger sense of stability in that process. And it really has assisted me in evolving myself, which allows more information to come through. And it's also helped Ryok to evolve too, because every time I channel him, there's this blending that takes place. So as he evolves, I'm evolving. As I evolve, he evolves. So it's this very positive feedback loop. And that's how I got started with this whole thing.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack. I seem to recall Bashar, Daryl Anka also started with a car ride in a craft and a very similar experience. Did you immediately recognize that?
Yes. Yeah, situation? I had heard his story. When I started getting into Bashar, I also became really fascinated with him because I was like, who's the person bringing this through? And I wanted to know his story. So I started watching interviews. And yeah, I had heard him tell that story of the broad daylight UFO encounter a couple times. So as soon as I saw the close one, the more physical one, that's when I was like, oh, I think what has happened to him is happening to me too. And yeah.
Did you ever get confirmation as to whose ship that was?
Ryok has said that it was, yeah, it was his. Yeah.
Okay, because I know the TR-3B triangle shaped UFOs are like US military technology. So it seems like there's multiple triangle crafts out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because Connecticut, right, it's where I'm residing currently for a little bit longer, is a place where there's tons of military bases. I mean, that's a huge thing out here, and research sites. I mean, there's a lot of that. So I definitely considered that. I was like, what if that was government craft, or what if this whole thing is like some, government conspiracy, that whole narrative went through my head. But when I look at everything that's been happening, it's like, if the government's responsible for that, oh my God, they must be doing some Kundalini yoga in those smoky rooms, But yeah, I have to say it's only brought goodness into my life and evolution into my life. So my hunch is the telepathic hit I got from Ryok of that was connected to him and his people, based off what's happened in my life since then, seems to be incredibly authentic.